So welcome everybody. This is the 19th GRC Supper Club, albeit the 4th virtual one. And when we did the trilogy, the COVID trilogy last, I think it was this time last year, I think none of us expected to go into a 4th virtual event. And I'm hoping this will be the last one before we actually go into face-to-face meetings again and live dinners. So we'll keep our fingers crossed there. So our third speaker, who's kindly stepped in from his panel role to embody the third speaker role. And I'd like to clarify, just for Paul's sake, that when I did the actual comms or the landing page for the event, I wrote the title because I did have one of our ex-colleagues, Rodney Andrews, call out the fact it said futurist. And I know that that wasn't something that you said, that was me that put that on there. And that was one of my props, was for me and you to look and radar scan into the future there as well. But no, I wrote that, not Paul. But he is an SME within the assurance industry, and I used to work with him at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's a real specialist in what he does. He is actually working for a public body at this minute in time, which I can't really mention. I think he can if he wants to, but he probably won't. But we want to
sound like a spy.
Well, that's a good way to sound, right?
It's not true though.
A futuristic digital spy. But in terms of what we'd like to speak about now, it was really to talk about the Bryden report that me and Paul caught up a couple of months ago actually, and Paul mentioned the Bryden report, and ever since it's been coming up in conversation since we had that chat. Really about specifically the title actually was born out of that conversation around the combined assurance and where we're going with the future of assurance, but also with the risk and compliance angle with the UK SOX-lite coming up. A lot of conversations and a lot of posts and webinars on LinkedIn at this minute in time. And then there's a few other areas. But I think if I welcome to the stage Paul, he's going to introduce our session on some general thoughts on how companies are combining their assurance practices. Is that a reasonable intro, Paul? Is that all right?
That's great. So thank you, Lee. So as a bit of background, never been involved in financial services, but I've done a lot across manufacturing, retail and utilities industry. So as Lee, I'm a chartered accountant, as Lee mentioned. I worked for quite a large number of years at PwC in external audit, internal audit, and also a lot of project review as well. More recently, I've worked in internal audit for a very large UK-based tobacco manufacturer that went through the whole SOX process sort of 3 or 4 years ago. So I've got quite a lot of relevant experience. I'll talk through as we go through an example. Now, in terms of the big thing that Lee mentioned at the moment, everyone's talking about the Bryden report. Now, the thing that drove Bryden was probably 3 or 4 years ago. You had a couple of more than a couple, but predominantly the failure of Carillion, but also British Home Stores. And a lot of the people were saying, where were the external auditors? And they're all turning around and say, well, we did what we were told to do, but the public were very rapidly losing faith in the audit process. That was recognised by one of the core governance bodies, so the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and they commissioned a guy called Donald Bryden to do a review. And it's actually quite a hard-hitting exercise. I mean, the thing that he said in his report that I think is quite appropriate, he talks about audit has lost its way and the actors in the process bear some of the responsibility. Now, he's very much focusing on the external auditors, but I think he was also talking to the internal audit function and also the compliance functions in these businesses as well. So as a result of that, Donald Bryden has come up with a paper that he probably issued getting on for 18 months ago, but because of COVID, the progress hasn't been that brilliant. But it does talk about this concept of UK SOX and directors taking more responsibility around the controls within a business. It's not quite finalised because it still be determined whether or not it's going to be like SOX in the US, whether you'll have a formal 302 attestation and a 404 by auditors. That still needs to be agreed. There's also, the broad and the breadth of the controls that are actually going to be part of the reporting, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and we can come back to UK SOX, but there was a lot of other interesting things within what he recommended. And there's 5 things that I just wanted to call out. He was just talking about having a much more informative audit report other than just commenting on the numbers in the financial statements. So the first thing that he talks about is much better independent disclosure on risks. Are the companies in their report really calling out what the risks are to the organisation and whether or not they're properly calling out the mitigating controls and activities they're putting in place to manage that. That was the first thing. The second thing he's really picked up on is fraud. making it much more formalized again for companies to talk about the steps they're undertaking to detect and prevent fraud, and the auditors to actually comment whether or not they think are appropriate. The other thing, and this very much comes down to Carillion, signed off set of accounts and then the company goes broke 2 months later. Much better commentary around the resilience of an organization, not just whether it's a going concern at the time that the auditors were signing, but actually whether it's got a future beyond, potentially up to 5 years in the future. And something that I thought was quite interesting, and we might have talked about like the third speaker is for the external auditors to comment on the culture of the company. So if the directors are putting forward a view on, we've got a great company, we're doing this, and if the auditors don't believe that, to actually formally say that within their reporting. And then finally, and this is very much sort of thing to my own heart, is he recognises and he wants to see better use of technology by the auditors, but also trying to encourage companies to actually share more of their data with the auditors so the auditors can do much better analytics. And he believes that this will promote better quality audits. So everybody focuses on the Bryden report and the UK SOX, but there are other things in there. So it's quite a mixed bag. As I say, it's going through consultation at the moment, but it's highly likely a lot of the recommendations that he puts in there will come to fruition in some way, shape or form. So that's the sort of outline of the Bryden process. And I think that, yes, a lot of you large UK companies and probably in the financial sector already comply with SOX, but there's a lot of normal FTSE 100 companies and FTSE 350 that have to produce accounts, but their controlled environment's quite informal and they don't actually have to demonstrate to anyone outside the company.
Yep.
Maybe the auditors will take a slightly different approach, but they're actually monitoring their controls and testing them on a regular basis and basically keeping on top. So that's a quick summary of where Bryden's come from.
No, that's a great summary, and it resonated in our conversation a few weeks ago with me, because that's what I was doing at PwC at the time, some of my time there, right? And working with companies that didn't have a clue about their risks and their controls. They definitely didn't understand what IT systems underpinned key controls and mitigating controls, and mapping out those processes and finding what was a control and what wasn't, which was also another issue, because they didn't know what a control was, right? So I know some of the the large tier one financial institutions will have adhered to the SEC, Sarbanes-Oxley, but there's many that probably UK and EMEA that probably haven't yet as well. And I know from my time in the Big Four and in the last 7 years in the technology side that many of them haven't got a real good grasp of their risk and control, or RACM or RCM, whatever you want to call it, across their business. It's quite siloed, it's quite on spreadsheets, it's access database, it's IT department versus business department. And that was really where the wheel behind, let me get it, because it took me 10 minutes to put together, so bear with me. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. I'll try and put it so you can see it on the light. But this is the TMS wheel. It's very much like Myers-Briggs. And the team management systems approach is really trying to use the personas across teams to make sure that you communicate in the right way, you understand your actions, and also communicate and deliver as well. Because if you're a controller producer against a creative innovator like myself, who's quite strategic, and you're an analyst in this area that likes the detail, you're going to get a clash. And there's a link this there, which I forgot to put in, is how do you make that link? How do you communicate that across that divide? And that's something I'm really passionate about. And that's what, Vicola was going to talk about behavioral change, because she's just set up the career masterclass, but she was ex-Barclays frontline as well. And that's what I've been chatting to her about, because, this is kind of my passion. But that's to your cultural shift piece, Paul, around, getting people educated on what they're doing, but not only that, educate them on what areas they are in here. Because near enough everyone probably on the call and in reasonably sized businesses has done something like this. We did something at ASIN 2 weeks ago around the Myers-Briggs, but no one ever utilizes that data, and definitely doesn't utilize it to enhance delivery of compliance and first and second line. And it's something I think they should do. And there's various ways they could tie that to technology as well. But I'll put this back because it's quite heavy, because it's my barbecue lid. So bear with me. Well, is that in line with what you were thinking, Paul?
Yeah, no, definitely. I suppose another thing, we sort of move on to sort of the concept of looking across the combined assurance spectrum.
Yep.
So a lot of things that you find is a lot of the UK corporates when they first put in SOX, they thought, well, we'll just get it in and then we'll look at how we can make it more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of them are finding actually their cost of SOX and other compliance functions is actually quite a considerable sum of money. And also they're getting last minute problems in terms of, control breaks down. So it's not only from a SOX point of view, but just generally when they're doing the audit. So a lot of them are starting to look about how they can combine their assurance functions, first, second, and third line defense, and make sure that they're actually recognizing the work that they do and maybe not over auditing particular areas. And one of the things that's really come to the fore is the use of technology around this. But the things we were starting to look at was also is how we could look at the underlying work of the compliance function and how that mapped through to the risks. And this whole thing around technology gives a lot of positives. You can do a proper top-down assessment, at an audit committee that says, these are our key corporate risks. Actually, yes, we have mitigating controls in place that help us reduce the residual risk, but who's actually testing those controls? Who's actually making sure they're working effectively? You get a much better visibility of all of the controls work that's done across the compliance function, whether that's truly helping the business address its key corporate risks. But it also helps different departments understand and how legal might be managing a particular sanctions risk, but it also might help manufacturing to understand what legal are doing and how they can actually contribute to that process in terms of the controls that they're testing. And then the other thing is, because you have these sort of control risk and controls ecosystems are underpinned by technology, because it's more dynamic and real time because you're doing continuous testing.
Yep.
Also helps you identify on a much quicker basis whether or not you've got a particular control breakdown, and people can address that. Similarly, if a new risk comes up, so everybody talks about COVID, and everybody would have said a year or so ago, oh yeah, we've got the pandemic in, we've recognized that in risk, but no one really recognized. They said it would be a pandemic, but it would be in a particular region because it only happened in the past in the Middle East or in Asia. People got caught out the fact that it was actually a global thing. But if you have these systems, you're able to respond to risks much quicker, things that come up unexpected. And then the other thing that I just want to talk to is what I'm quite passionate about is, to be honest with you, if you're doing an external audit or an internal audit, or you're doing a plant, you're doing loads of detailed testing, it can actually be quite boring. If you can use the technology,
I can attest to that.
if you can use the technology to take that drudgery, you could use robots or things like that to do some of the testing for you and provide you with the information. People in the compliance function tend to be more motivated, but they have more, they're keener on what they're doing, but it also allows them to look across the data to look better at the trends and things like that. So they can actually start to see maybe this sort of forward looking to see whether or not a trend where controls are starting to break down in the region. So technology can also not only improve your staff morale, but it frees up time for the staff to actually identify where potential risks could become issues in the near future. So it's a bit around that. So I know we were talking about the combined thing, but I also wanted to sort of give a view around how technology could help with this whole combined assurance ecosystem.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And, and this is a peer thought leadership. It's not a sales engine. Yeah. So, I'm not going to talk from where I sit now at ASIN, but there's also that community intelligent aspect as well, in terms of, the testing aspect that you mentioned within a global firm, but there's also across firms within financial services, within, non-financial services, and how there's a shift there with technology, with our futurist kind of, looking at the horizon side of things, with new technology coming forward. You've got your fintechs, your regtechs, your subtechs, the supervisory techs, the new one, right? Subtech, and all those coming as well. So combining all those to, project internally and making sure that those connections work is something that's quite key. But one question's come in, which is, what is the expected impact from the Bryden report on the scope of auditors? You might have touched on this already, and UK listed companies. Whilst the concept is, about the reporting requirement, what other aspects is there?
So I think, it's a really good question, actually. So I think external auditors today would just say, well, we just look at the annual report and the financial statement. And I think what Bryden said, no, corporates nowadays are pushing out a lot more information, how they're dealing with climate change, environmental, social, how they're looking after their.
Well, it's funny you should mention climate change and ESG, because we have someone on the panel that might be able to explain a bit more about that. So that's good.
So I think I think what Donald Bryden was saying was, yes, but you guys need to do a lot more. You actually need to independently validate some of this information these companies are putting out there. So, I've touched on the different principles around fraud, et cetera, et cetera. But I suppose the essence is to give a much more comprehensive coverage, the external audit give a much more comprehensive coverage of the information that the company's putting out there, rather than just the historical financial statements. A bit more look into the future when companies are talking about what they're doing around climate change, their workers and things like that, to actually validate that what they're saying is truly correct, or how they're going to manage future risks and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's really, really good point. And another area which I was going to draw into Bakala's conversation around behavioural change again was about the rise in senior risk professionals on LinkedIn. And I presume most people on this call are LinkedIn because they probably saw my incessant posting about this event on there. But in terms of these senior professionals at tier 1 banks, financial services and beyond are posting a lot on LinkedIn about their connections or meetings on regulations or with associations. I'm seeing more and more of that on LinkedIn, which I think to this self-demonstration piece, and the social media aspect of proving they're doing that. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on regulation in general, stuff that's probably not so much impacted on financial services, but others. So just a couple of examples. So we've talked about GDPR, that's been in for 3 years. But things like the EU directive around single-use plastics, trying to get rid of people buying a water bottle, you drink the water, you just chuck the bottle away. They're trying to reduce that, or you've seen that with 10p now for a shopping bag, whereas previously you would have got them for free. So that's driven that, and companies are having to respond to that because they're have to start recycling stuff that comes in, secondly. And then there's other things, and we'll probably talk about that. So for instance, there's a new bit of regulation that's coming in for 2023 and 2025, the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. So companies are going to have to say how they're managing the risk of all of this climate change legislation coming in. I know Joe Biden has been talking about coming in with a whole new swathe of regulation as part of his legacy as a president around climate change and the use of plastics and emissions and things like that. So there's a lot of challenges to companies, again, about how they recognise and respond to the risk that they're not doing what they want. And maybe one of the things we'll talk about, so it's not just governments now that judge companies on how they're doing responding to climate change or use. But one of the things we can talk about is consumerisms. There's a lot of things on social media now where companies are marked down quite actively by probably younger generations if they're seen to be environmentally bad or things like that. And people tend to shy away from buying their products and things like that. So the whole thing around the consumer and climate change, there's a whole lots of different risks coming in that these companies need to respond to. That isn't just about regulation, it's also about society's expectations as well, which sometimes preempt particular legislation, regulation.
No, absolutely. And I think someone mentioned on the call the other day about the tipping point or the wobble point. I like the term wobble point, actually. We've hit zero bang on, actually, which is perfect timing. So no, thank you very much, Paul, for that, and stepping in at the last minute to take the final spot for us. A big thank you to our co-sponsors for tonight's event. That's ASIN and Capco. Also, a big thank you to the Women in Risk and Control, who this is in association with, and the RegTech Forum, for helping us with speakers and for content for this session as well.